hotel room. So we're going to film this class from our hotel. I just need to figure out how to put this here. I think that's probably okay. That should work, right?
Perfect.
Oh, but now we can't see you.
That's okay.
Well, no, it's not okay because we need to be able to see you, because if we don't see you, then it's like, where's Jenline? So I'm going to try to get this set up. This is what happens when we're not in the car.
Instagram is usually just you. I think that'll be just okay.
There we go. And there we go. I was also going to say, if you want, you could sit in the chair.
No,
so people don't, like, you don't feel uncomfortable.
No, I feel totally comfortable.
Okay. All right. Hello and welcome, everybody. This is going to be the second class in the Introduction to Early Christian Thought series, which is part of our Introduction to Philosophy series. And we're going to be talking about St. Paul. But we're going to be talking about the way in which St. Paul relates to Alain Badiou and to Zizek, because both St. Paul and Zizek have very different takes on the importance of St. Paul. And there's a certain irony by which St. Paul, who is usually influential for conservative Christian thinkers, became a touchstone for more left-wing theologians, but also more left-wing thinkers in general. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. It's not going to be too technical, and we're going to try to have it a little bit as a conversation if we can.
Sounds good.
Does that sound good, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so gentlemen, there's a big TV in this room.
Yes.
And we were watching something on this TV yesterday. Do you remember that?
We were. Something other than baseball, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Thor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, what were we watching?
We were watching the final moments of Thor Ragnarok.
Yeah, we were watching Thor Ragnarok yesterday on the TV in our hotel room. And it occurred to me suddenly that there's a sneaky thing that happens. I'm not sure if you agree with me here, but I have a couple of examples to make my case. There's a sneaky thing happens where we take supposedly pagan religion and supposedly pagan ideology and myth-making and storytelling, and we sort of superimpose Christian narratives on them.
Christmas trees is sort of the classic example.
Yeah.
It's that a lot of Christmas-related ritual and even Easter symbolism is...
But there's something different that happens here. By the way, can I bully you for a moment? Oh, everything just fell.
Sorry.
That's okay. We don't have a tripod here, so everything is just very improvised. Sorry about that.
I can switch you.
No, it's okay. No, I wasn't going to say switch me. I was just going to make you aware of the fact that everything was about to fall. Oops. Sorry, guys. Very stellar production values. Gentlemen, can you be in the frame, though, for this room? Is that okay? Yeah. Or just if you sit here?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Mm-hmm. Is that better?
Yeah, I think that's better. We only have one chair in this hotel room, so anyway, this is super awkward. I don't want to create like a Harvey Weinstein kind of like situation where it's like, come, let's do this class in the hotel room. I'm in my bathrobe. Like, that's not what this is, I hope.
No.
So I have this theory, which is that, I mean, you're right. Like, we have certain things that are incorporated or integrated within Christianity. Like, you could say, like, Christmas tree, for example. Or if you once you take like a little angel or Holy Spirit or whatever you put on the Christmas tree, that's fusion. But that's not what I mean at all. What I mean is that we take overtly, supposedly pagan, let's call it like a mise en scène, and we infuse it with Christian, with a very Christian logic, Christian dimension. And there's a couple examples of that, but one of them for me is very specifically Thor Ragnarok. Spoilers for Thor Ragnarok if you have not seen this movie yet. I feel like we should no longer have to do spoilers in general,
yes.
right?
Everyone's caught up. The pandemic gave everyone a chance to catch up.
Yeah, exactly. So Thor Ragnarok, it's like of course it's the universe of whatever, Celtic, I guess? Celtic universe. Nordic, thank you.
Yeah.
People know this, I don't have to go on about this. They're in Valhalla, they're battling for Valhalla. And so what is Ragnarok? What does Ragnarok stand for? Do you remember?
Well, it's the collapse of, not Valhalla, but whatever their kingdom is called that's escaping me.
No, Ragnarok is the version of the apocalypse, first of all.
Right, it's the collapse of that place.
Collapse? What do you mean by collapse?
The destruction.
Yeah, exactly, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the destruction, the absolute decimation of their ancestral homeland, basically, Ragnarok. And so what happens in the movie is that they're supposed to be fighting against Ragnarok, preventing Ragnarok from happening. And then there's a specific moment in the movie where they realize that maybe all along they're not supposed to prevent Ragnarok from happening. They're actually supposed to enable the conditions for Ragnarok to happen.
Yes.
And what happens after Ragnarok? Like, what is the reversal that takes place when they may have that insight?
Well, the reversal is they have this, I mean, the process to the reversal is they have already captured this demon who is totally focused on destruction. And in unleashing that is the only thing that will allow Ragnarok to happen, which is both the destruction of their enemy as well as the destruction of their homeland.
Okay, true.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the plot mechanism, totally.
Okay.
And I don't want to do all these leading questions,
Yeah.
but like it really
Okay.
helps. Yeah, exactly. What engineers the switch, the perspectival shift here from we have to save the place of Valhalla is a scene in which Thor has an encounter with the ghost of Odin, essentially. and the ghost of Odin says, what is it, Valhalla, I guess?
It's not Valhalla.
It's not Valhalla, it's something else, whatever. He says, whatever the realm is, whatever Marvel geeks, he says, it's not a place, it's a people, essentially. He says it's not a place, it's a people. You don't have to save the homeland because wherever your people are will be the homeland.
Yeah.
And so they realize that Ragnarok is creating the conditions for the people coming together. They go on into space, whatever. Yeah. This is a Christian logic. This is a restaging of the Christian redemptive resurrection narrative. The Christian community coming into being after the loss of the Christian home, whether you see it in the New Testament or you see it in the Old Testament with the idea of the Jewish people, etc. We have here distinctly Judeo-Christian logic that is being superimposed onto the pagan universe.
Right.
Because none of this works within the pagan logic itself. And this is something that we do quite a lot in our culture, is that and so the funny thing is, like, our culture is a lot more religious than people understand. Another example of that is if you take the two Wagner operas that are sort of mostly contrasted here. We have the pagan Wagner opera, which is your favorite.
The Ring Cycle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sorry, you're gonna say?
4 operas, but yes.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
It's an epic
I know
cycle
what
of
you
4
mean.
operas. Fair enough,
Yeah.
Fair enough.
But that would be contrasted with like Parsifal, maybe, which is the most explicitly religious opera.
Yeah, yeah, you're totally right. Yeah, we have, on the one hand, we have the Ring Cycle, Wagner's epic, as you put it, 4 opera cycle, where, let's list them very quickly. First we have, I don't know, what's the first one? I always say the first one is Rheingold, thank you. Then we have Siegfried, then we have the Valkyrie, and then we have Götterdämmerung.
Right.
Okay. Götterdämmerung is another word for Ragnarok, essentially. It is the twilight of the gods. You start seeing the influences in Nietzsche here as well, because Nietzsche was a huge Wagner fanboy and then fell out with Wagner. And why did Nietzsche fall out with Wagner? Was specifically because of Parsifal, because Nietzsche believed that Wagner had betrayed his aesthetic, artistic cause by succumbing to a form of religious mysticism. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I think that it took Wagner almost 30 years to complete the Ring Cycle, to compose it. He wrote the lyrics, he composed the music, he designed how it would look aesthetically, so it was really a lifelong project. And through that project, he worked on other operas. And so it's interesting to see how his other work is sort of refracted through the Ring. I think that Parsifal is maybe not his final opera.
Well, Wagner wrote the Ring, yeah, I think Parsifal is, but he wrote the Ring backwards also. Like, he didn't write it in succession. I think Siegfried was the main piece that he wrote early. Anyway, we don't have to.
Anyway.
We don't have to get too much in the woods here. The funny thing, though, is that Nietzsche was essentially wrong. And what Nietzsche failed to understand here is that the funny thing is, like, when someone is in a relationship and they say, "I'm leaving you because of this," you could say, "Well, you're leaving me. You're leaving me. It's fine, but you're leaving me for the wrong reasons."
You're doing the right thing for the wrong reasons.
Thank you. The right thing for the wrong reasons. Nietzsche was doing the right thing for the wrong reasons, because that form of idealist Christian mysticism is less present in Parsifal, which is more pagan, actually, and more present in The Ring. The Ring is doing the same thing that Thor Ragnarok does, which is just presenting this mise en scène, which is, especially for Wagner, very distinctly a mise en scène, because he writes all the stage directions and the costumes and all this stuff, that is set in a pagan universe. Also, why so many, when you go to a staging of The Ring, for example, in the United States, it's a little bit like going to Comic-Con. because usually like opera is like all high culture and people in bow ties and stuff, and then you go to the Ring and it's like Comic-Con. Everyone's dressed up in furs and like cosplaying all the various you know what I mean, yeah, Wotan, like it's very heavy on that. And Wagner was sort of aware of this, but the logic of the Ring cycle is distinctly, again, the Christian redemptive narrative.
Well, and I think it also helps to, I mean, when approaching a piece of art or literature, is to see how it's simultaneous. Where is the work trying to undermine something, and where is it trying to affirm something? And so it's able to affirm this sort of Christian mythos and ethic by undermining it through the pagan archetypes.
Yeah. I mean, we do this a lot, that we, it's not even appropriation, it's just kind of interesting, because we're very uncomfortable with like outright Christian narratives, but they're sort of, the Judeo-Christian logic suffuses so much of our culture. Another example, we're not going to do a whole thing here, is the other one would be The Matrix. The Matrix is set as a distinctly Orientalist fantasy with Oriental wisdom and kung fu and shots that are taken directly from like anime and stuff like this. At the end of the day, it is Christian logic. It's neo-Christ-like figure, etc. And I'm not saying that as in like, oh, these films secretly have an agenda. It's about pointing out how integral the redemptive structure of the Christian logic remains. And when I say logic, I'm not talking about the Christian mythology. I'm specifically talking about the philosophical argument that the New Testament is making. And this is not a philosophical argument that really existed before St. Paul. And specifically also St. Paul's epistles to the Romans. The idea that we have here a transcendent Christ that fuses in a very specific moment, the moment of crucifixion, the universal of the deity and the particular of Christ's quote-unquote failure or triumph through failure on earth. But without getting into the woods, there's more that we can talk here. So we talked about Nietzsche for a moment, right? How Nietzsche was so much against Wagner because of his supposed mysticism. And what we're seeing here prefigured are a couple things. First of all, an age-old debate between idealism and materialism, which is really integral to understanding how Christianity is interpreted today. Because one of the things that, not starting with Nietzsche, but that we can see strongly in Nietzsche is a suspicion, a very rightful suspicion, that of the idea that there is some ideal or pure form. It's a sort of an anti-Platonic sentiment as well, that it's a cop-out for us to believe that there is some heaven or some ideal, and we actually have to bring it back into a materialist critique. And for Nietzsche, as a founding father of existentialism, that materialism is not Marxist materialism, what would become Marxist materialism, but it is specifically being itself. It is existence, it is being in the world. Think about Heidegger, the importance of Heidegger and Nietzsche. And there's something that I find really interesting about Heidegger and Nietzsche, which is that both of them are, in a sense, atheist thinkers, right? They stress the importance of the death of God. And at the same time, and I think this is something that I've harped on in other classes, there's almost no one who takes God more seriously than Nietzsche and Heidegger, which is kind of like this interesting paradox, because think about it, for Nietzsche the idea is that God is dead and we have killed him. And so there's a couple ways to look at that.
But in a sense, it also makes him more powerful. Like I think about the slogan, as it were, "The king is dead, long live the king." The idea that the death of something is always going to be the attributing more power to it because it has been undermined in a sense.
Yeah, it creates an opening, a radical opening. Christianity is one of the only religions where the fundamental doctrine of Christianity is a schism within Christianity itself, a split. We no longer have an omnipotent Father or God. We specifically have a God who actualizes through what, to all intents and purposes, appears as a failure of Christ on earth.
Right.
And so Nietzsche's idea, well, maybe we'll take a step back before we get to Nietzsche and Heidegger, but they're both really integral here, I think.
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that despite their atheism, they are relevant Christian thinkers in a sense.
I mean, Götterdämmerung. The funny thing about Wagner and Nietzsche is like you can really see how close they're here. And where Nietzsche, anyway, Götterdämmerung, the final opera in the Ring cycle that Wagner has, that Nietzsche loved and absolutely adored, is literally the Twilight of the Gods. It is the burning down of, again, Valhalla, I think in this case. We see a repeat of Ragnarok, or foreshadowing, a burning down of Valhalla. And from that, we have the emergence of the Christian community. Not Christian, see, I'm Freudian slip. The emergence of the human community, the Odin-like scene that we have in Ragnarok, where he says, I guess I'm just gonna say Valhalla or whatever.
Mhm.
It's not Valhalla. It's something
I know,
else.
and I can't
Whatever.
believe that I can't
Whatever.
Whatever.
It's
That
not
place.
it's not a place. It's a people. We have the same thing that happens here. It's not a place. It's the people. And depending on how the final stage of the ring cycle is presented on stage, you have certain arguments about that. Like, do the people turn their backs to the gods? Do they face the fire? We've seen different versions of the opera as well.
Yeah, but there's usually, I think there's staging instructions about the figure of humanity rising from the ashes,
Yeah.
sort of literally. I think Wagner was notorious for writing these incredibly unrealistic staging directions, which really frustrate a lot of people, but also...
I'm glad that you mentioned the phoenix from the ashes, because this is where Christianity makes a break with Celtic pagan or even Buddhist religions, which is it's not about a cycle. That's super important here, and this is something that the Paulinian gospel is really aware of. It's Asgard. Someone said it's Asgard.
Thank you.
It's not about everything is just a circle and humanity has to crumble and then rise up from the ashes. It's not the wheel of fortune that's turning where your fortunes are either on the bottom or on the top. It's specifically that within that there is no continuum, but that there is only ever a gap in the continuum from which the truth emerges. That the truth is not an endpoint, but the truth is something that emerges. And again, it depends on, again, if you go with like someone like Badiou or Zizek, whether that truth is imminent to the unfolding or whether it's external. That's something I'll try to explain a little bit more. There's a television series that almost every of our bonus podcasts I tell people to watch. I don't like giving people recommendations because honestly I could care less what you watch. But this is something that you should watch, and it's called The Young Pope. The Young Pope is a television series by Paolo Sorrentino with Jude Law in the role. And the idea is that yeah. Okay, you like the show too, right?
No, I think it's phenomenal. It really rewards rewatching because a lot of it you can be sort of going along, oh, this is funny, this is clever, and then something will happen that can seem quite abrupt or quite confusing or quite overwhelming, but I think it raises a lot of really interesting philosophical and theological questions. So one of my favorite scenes is when the Pope has just been elected. One of the PR representative comes to him with all of the... Oh, I think we just lost.
Oh, sorry guys, I think we lost our Instagram, so I'm gonna go back onto Instagram. Yeah.
And she has the design for the plates, and she wants to know how he wants to be portrayed on the papal plates. And he just wants it to be an empty plate. And there's a lot of discussion about, what is the appearance, what is the, how does the church look, how does representation appear? Because when I first watched it, I thought, well, the Christian church is all about representation. It is all about visual, decoration. And there are other religions that say we shouldn't have human portrayal of anything divine. So it's interesting to see that.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're talking about there's a theme in the show called presence is absence. It's sort of like one of the motifs that runs throughout the show. It's the idea that we will desire something more if it is absent. So the Pope specifically makes himself absent. No one knows what the Pope looks like to create a form of mystery. And then the theological debate of the show becomes, does this create a form of negative idol worship where no one cares about God, they just want you. Whereas the Pope argues that when they think they want me, they want God. It's interesting.
Yeah.
So there's something in the Young Pope. First of all, I'm just going to interrupt myself very quickly. If you're watching on Instagram, welcome back. Our Instagram crashed. Fret not. We are recording this on YouTube as we speak. We're also recording this as a podcast, so you can find different versions of this. So there's a quote that there's plenty of quotes that I like, because Paulo Sorrentino is a very good screenwriter. He writes his own films. And there's a specific sequence where the young Pope, played by Jude Law, is asked whether or not he believes in God. I mean, he's asked a couple of times. He always has different answers. You know how, like, in the Dark Knight movie, the Joker always has different origin stories when he's asked about, like, how did you get your scars? That's played out in the Young Pope as well, where he's often asked, do you believe in God? And he always comes up with different answers. And someone in the Discord actually asked me the same thing. I mean, I get asked whether I believe in God all the time. It's actually a surprisingly frequent question. Although the polite version, I hadn't realized this, apparently the polite way to ask if you believe in God now is to say, are you a theist? Do you believe there could be a a God, or there should be a God, or would be a God, which I like. That's a very good question, actually. And so someone in the Discord asked what my conception of belief is. And so my conception of the belief is actually very well put in the Young Pope. So he says, to believe in God is to believe in nothing. And this is something that I find really interesting because it seems like a crazy cynical statement. And is he saying that God is a form of nothingness, which is, you could make philosophical arguments about that, but I don't think it's true. Or is he saying that you have to be so radical or fundamentalist that when you believe in God, you believe in nothing else? And in a sense, what's really interesting here is the belief in God exclusionary towards everything else? And so we have to go back to the idea of what does it mean to believe? And this is one of the Paulinian ideas as well. What is the relationship between faith, grace, and hope? Faith, grace, and hope. Faith is the idea that you believe in something without having seen it. Grace is that you act as if that thing existed. And hope is that you're acting and believing with the hope that what you do won't matter, but it will matter to somebody else. This is the beautiful Adorno's quote. I may be repeating myself here. Yes, there is hope, but not for us. Ja, es gibt Hoffnung, aber nicht für uns. That is the idea of Christian hope. The hope should be detached from your own personal hope. You should be saying, do you have hope for somebody else? Which of course can be very pedantic as well. You can say like, oh, I have hope for you, you poor suffering souls, you haven't stepped into the light of God, etc. Yeah. And so what's really important here is about, before we even get to the Trinity, is that a trifecta between faith, grace, and hope. And this is where the word like ipsis becomes really important, because the question is, do we have acts of grace? Do we have works of grace? Can you actually work towards being faithful? And this was it continues and remains to be a huge theological debate. We once did a whole class like a year ago, I think, on whether God can believe in himself.
Yeah.
And so where you see resonances of St. Paul is, for example, even in Luther. Luther created many controversies, but one of the controversies that Luther had particularly was the idea that he said that you would be saved, that salvation of the soul would occur through faith alone. And in German, he put in the allein. Is this something that you've come across before? Yeah. Sola, no, I think it's per sola fide. This is like two of the, like three, I guess, most inflammatory words within the relationship, or the schism between Catholicism and Protestantism. And it's funny because I was raised as a Catholic, and it's taken me a long time to appreciate Protestantism, because a lot of what's happened within Protestantism now, ironically, is actually enacting what Protestants thought was wrong with Christianity, with Catholicism. Because now we associate Protestantism so strongly with this idea that it's quite political, you just focus on the text, we don't want the ritual of the church, etc. But some of those early texts were specifically saying, what we want is not the works or acts of grace. We want to go back to the fact that faith is itself enough. That faith is itself redemptive. And Luther was trying to defend himself here, and he said, oh, it's just a grammatical thing, the allein came in because of the German grammar, and
it's a typo. No, I mean, not a typo, but yeah.
Yeah, but the word alone here is not actually in the Greek or in the Latin. Some people say that it's inferred through Greek or Latin, but it's quite a political statement as well. It's because it's not one amongst many things, right? If we have, again, the Paulinian idea of the faith, hope, and grace, it's actually saying that faith is the only one. In a sense, allein, right? Per sola fide. It's only through grace it's only through faith that we are redeemed. And so that's kind of it's a big leap to make. Why would that one have so much particular value? And this is where, again, you have to go back to the Paulinian logic of Christ on the cross's transcendence. But back to the young Pope.
Is it, because I don't want to divert you too much, but my reading was always, or my understanding was always that it was faith in contrast with acts of not tithing, but where you pay money to the church and people pray for you, and that absolves you of your sin. That's what he was reacting against. So it wasn't even about good behavior, being a good Christian. It was about
his reaction to good works, specifically though.
Okay,
It's reaction to good works. It's the idea that to be part of the Christian community means that you act according to good works, and that's how you would come up to God, and that there's a hierarchy of who has done better good works. So it's like we're back in the Orwellian logic of everyone is equal, but some are more equal than others. Everyone is a light in the eyes of God, but some shine brighter than others. You know what I mean?
Gotcha.
And of course you don't want to shine too bright, because then God's like, get out of my eyes. You know what I mean? Like, etc. Like, I mean, does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so, what? Back to the young pope. The young pope is this idea, which is that to believe in God is to believe in nothing. And the thing that you immediately have to be reminded of here is the Dostoevsky thing that Derrida uses, and Zizek has used, and Lacan has used, which is the idea that if God exists, so there's a play on it. The Dostoevsky version is if God exists, then nothing is permitted. And the twist that Lacan has on this, that Zizek has on it as well, is he says if God exists, then everything is permitted. And so what for Dostoevsky is basically saying God exists as a prohibition. Because of God, I can't, I don't know, put my hands under the cover or something at night, whatever. I mean, this idea of like all these moralizing prohibitions. And from a Lacanian perspective, it's the exact opposite. It's because you have this overarching master figure, symbolic, the big others, symbolic, etc. It's through that universe that you can do everything. It's because you're saying, yes, there's some big guy in the sky, but I don't have to see him, and so I can act as if he existed. And that's also what Nietzsche is going towards with the idea that we killed God, and now we have to, in a sense, make a God. This is where we go from Nietzsche to Heidegger, right? Heidegger is essentially answering Nietzsche. Nietzsche says, God is dead, and we have killed him. Just a statement. Heidegger says, if God is dead, and if we have killed him, then it is up to us to create a God. Because, as I already said, Kant has this idea that man is the only animal that wants to choose its own master. And so if we've killed the idea of master, what becomes the idea of master next? And so Lacan's very aware of this when he plays around with Dostoevsky. The idea is that because God exists, and Lacan is not a theologian, he doesn't believe in God, etc. But because God exists, the idea of God, everything is prohibited. It's not that you can't do things because of God, it's that suddenly you can do. It's like when you're in a relationship, you give each other license. There's a lot that I wouldn't do by myself, but when I'm with somebody else, I feel like, hey, let's go and do this, let's go and do this.
Absolutely.
And so here we have already the idea that faith becomes primary, more than grace, because as long as you believe that there is, then you can start doing whatever you want. And so to go back to the young pope, to believe in God is to believe in nothing, is exactly that kind of fruitful nothingness. If I have rules and laws that I have to follow, and obligations and all this, there's so much that I can't do. Whereas if I believe in God, I believe in nothing, and so at that point I can do anything I want. There's this sort of like nihilistic anarchy towards pure belief in its most direct form. And this is actually quite important from a Paulinian perspective, because what Paul is specifically trying to point out is the way in which Christ superseded the universe of law. And the universe of law was the Galatian law, and it was very much the Judean law.
The Ten Commandments.
Yeah, everything. So within like the time when in that time, the idea is that we have all these social rules, social laws that are all within Judean thought, which exists today. Part of what makes Jewish comedy so great and Jewish humor so great is that it's always undermining the relationship to the law. Because the entire logical universe of Judaism is about what is your particular relationship to the myriad of rules that you have to constantly abide by. And Christianity is in a sense upending that and saying there is only one rule. That rule is God. And if you believe in God, you don't have to believe in anything else. There is no rule as a sense. That's also like where Protestantism is secretly quite, I mean, everyone knows it's radical, but it's secretly very radical, because when you go to Luther's per sola fide, it's really going back to saying we don't need the rituals, we don't need the institutions, we don't need that. We need this radical thing, which is a form of lawlessness within Christ himself. Christ is like the total anarchist here in a sense, but specifically not just an anarchist, but again for Badiou or Zizek, a communist. Now, Zizek and Badiou are not saying that Christ is a communist, which would be a ridiculous thing to say. I mean, there's some people on the left who are like, Christ is a communist because he consorted with the lowest in society and with prostitutes and so on and so forth. Yeah, but that's not the point at all. The problem is that people make a mistake here about communism, or leftism in general, which is that they think it's like, again, of works, the works of communism. What do communists do? Communists hang out with prostitutes, etc. No, it's specifically about a very specific philosophical logic, which is that instead of having a continuum based on order or law, which was the Judean idea that you had a naturally imposed order and law that you had to follow and that you were doing a service to God by means of following that law, is that there's a fissure, a break within God's omnipotence, and that creates the opening for Christ. And that creates götterdämmung, the burning down of the belief in God as an omnipotent being, and the creation of the responsibility of the human subject themselves. So there's something very and so if when people say, oh, leftist theology, etc., they're not saying this is what you're doing. It's a logical argument. It's this: is there a natural order, which would be a conservative argument, and you follow that, or is the order itself the breakdown of that order? I think we can come up with a couple more intuitive examples here. I know that I'm on a roll, but if you want to
really good structure, yeah.
I don't know if you want to jump in, if there's just to slow my roll. I don't know.
That's really helpful. I think that idea of the conservative aspect is, here are the laws. Here is what allows the system to maintain the status quo, and Christianity is, in a sense, a rupture of those laws.
There's a really good example of this in the Count of Monte Cristo, which has a lot of little things about Christianity, etc. In the Count of Monte Cristo, the book, by the way, I don't think it's in the movie. There's a scene. One of the things that the Count of Monte Cristo does is that, it's a serialized story, but it has all these vignettes, it has stories within stories. And one of them is that I think it's the Count, because he's in prison for a very long time, is watching two men being brought to the gallows to be hanged. And he says that both of the men, sorry, I'm losing my voice a little bit.
Do you want some water?
Do you have any water? He says that both of the men are sort of meek. It's like they've accepted their fate, and they're just sort of walking to the gallows, and they're going to be killed. They're going to be hanged. And none of them are protesting because they've just checked out. It's like full disassociation from their fate. And what happens is that the two men are standing there, and suddenly one of them is pardoned. I may be getting this wrong. I think it's not two men. I think it's two animals. I think in the story it's specifically two animals or something, but I don't even remember. And one of them is pardoned. And then as soon as one of them is pardoned and he gets to walk off, the other one freaks out. He gets frothing at the lips, really angry. This is unjust, blah, 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 blah. Just totally the disassociation is broken. And the funny thing is, this is exactly, again, the Christian Paulinian universe. As long as we're within the realm of law, we don't have genuine, authentic subjectivity. We just say, well, this is the rules, and I'm a thief, and I got caught, and now I'm being punished for it, and I can see that this is virtuous because somebody else is being punished too. And so I'm not going to resist. And then there's a breakdown of the appearance of justice within the law, as in this thief gets pardoned and you don't get pardoned, and suddenly there's this kind of horrific emergence of my assertion of humanity. Screw this, well, I'm so angry, how did this guy get to live, I don't get to live, it's that, the pure, pure drive, in a sense. And there's this beautiful quote in Marcuse, where Marcuse says that the condition for liberation is freedom. We have to think about that for a moment. Freedom is the condition for liberation. We cannot liberate ourselves. We cannot become liberated without already being free in the first place. Because the idea was always that you are in chains and that you become free. I don't know, this is where Marx is too simplistic always, where I really dislike Marx. He says, all we have to lose is our chains. No, you have a lot more to lose than your chains. There's a lot more to lose than your chains. The idea is always that we're enslaved and then we become free. But that's not how it works at all. It's when you are free that you can then be liberated. Do you see what I mean? If you are enchained, you're not going to free yourself. You have to free yourself first, and then the question is, what do you do with that freedom? And that is liberation. And this isn't just a rhetorical difference. That is specifically the question in the Paulinian conception of the crucifixion, which is that Christ releases you from your sins. You are now free. What do you do with that freedom? What happens the day after? That is the process of liberation. The thing that has set you free has happened, and it is now up to you to do something with that. And that is the fundamental split within Christianity. It's not everything that has order, and all you have to do is follow that order, and you will eventually ascend to the heavens. It's saying that there is a radical disorder. There is a gap that is being created within the edifice of Christian logic itself. You are now free. You are free from Christian law. And it is up to you to liberate yourself, which is a very radical thing. And this, one of the things that Zizek, for example, has always argued, he said that there's an atheist strain within Christianity. That Christianity is, and remember last class, I was saying that part of why I decided that I wasn't into atheism as we know it today, like popular atheism, is because I feel like we deserve a better class of atheism. And the better class of atheism is Christianity, basically. Christianity's always been the triple star version of atheism. If you want to be a true atheist today, you have to go through Christianity, in a sense. Because Christianity has within its own logic a disruptive stance. I mean, you start understanding why it was also such a threat to the Romans. There's something distinctly anarchic and proto-enlightenment about the Christian break here, which is saying that, like, if you are both the men walking to the gallows in, like, the Monte Cristo universe, kind of Monte Cristos, you're just following the law. When there's a rupture within the law, and you suddenly realize that you have been freed, or the other person's been freed, it creates tension, it creates antagonism. The question, as Zizek has always put it, is not what happens during the revolution, what happens after the revolution. And for Alain Badiou, the revolution is the crucifixion. And after that, it's always the question, what does the human community do? What does the Christian community do?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the secondary aspect of what you didn't talk about is, I mean, that's sort of the parallel with Thor Ragnarok, is that then is the creation of this community that is a community by dint of calling itself a community. There is no secret. There is nothing that's hidden about it. Yeah.
It's really important, the idea of revelation. Absolutely, right? The revelation of Christianity is that there is no revelation. That is the secret. It's funny because I don't want to, this is accidental. I'm not doing a Zizek thing here, but Zizek talks about Kung Fu Panda. There is genuinely something worth pointing out in Kung Fu Panda. This is an accident. I didn't plan this. Like, there's a scene in Kung Fu Panda where there's like this vase that, again, how quote unquote Orientalist movies have all kinds of Christian logic in them. There's this, and I'm not saying there's an agenda or whatever. Screw that. There's a vase, and he's not allowed to touch it. It's like the vase of some like mystic Kung Fu master. And I forget. Now I need to go watch Kung Fu Panda again. But I think there's like some secret in. Oh, the scroll. Of course, this is what it is, right? There's a scroll, and if you read the scroll, then you get all the powers, etc., and you become like the great Kung Fu master. And of course, finally he reaches the scroll and he opens the scroll and there's nothing in the scroll. The point of getting to the scroll was already that process. And that's what the logic of Christianity is that there is no revelation. There is nothing behind the curtain except the curtain itself. We're back in the Lacanian reading of the Parisian veil. The truth does not exist behind the barrier. The truth is in the barrier itself. The thing that seems to be the exception to the rule is the rule itself. And here you can start seeing some of the themes that I've tried to hammer home throughout this class, is where we're eventually going to get towards Marxism, etc. One of the funny things about Marxism, by the way, I want to say something here. There's a joke that Zizek has. Every once in a while, I read things and then I realize where Zizek gets his jokes from, and it's really weird to see a Zizek joke in somebody else's work, and you're like, oh, I know this joke's for these jokes. It's like, no, he's taking this from someone, which is, of course, how jokes work. I'm not saying that there's plagiarism involved, but Zizek has a joke that he takes from Simone Weil. And because I was reading Simone Weil's notebooks, and she specifically makes this joke, but not for an audience. She's entertaining herself. And Zizek takes that joke as well. And he says that it used to be, for Marxism, for sort of classic historical materialism, that religion was the opium of the people. And now, of course, people is the opium of the people. And that's kind of what Simone Weil is saying as well. She used to say that religion used to be considered the opium of the people. Now revolution, the idea of revolution is the opium of the people. We keep people in place by the idea of the revolution.
This was a really important thing that you've pointed out a couple of times, and I think it's really worth emphasizing, is that the status quo is not static.
Right.
In order for the status quo to be maintained, there has to be forms of upheaval and how you deal with that upheaval and that change. And that has to be reintegrated back into the status quo. And so that's part of how you can have this notion of constant revolution and undermining and disruption. And that only serves to maintain the status quo.
This is the difference between a real event and a pseudo event, or a real event and a reactionary event. A reactionary event will always promise you that there's a revolution taking place, but everything stays the same. I'm super against this. Like, that's why in the last class with you about communism, I was pointing out like the violence implicit in the system itself. I was basically reenacting what the peasant does in the Monty Python and the Holy Grail movie. You know that, so what's so beautiful about the Monty Python and the Holy Grail movie is that the entire movie is basically this. The king, who has divine authority, goes out into the land and is confronted with the fact that being someone who has divine authority means that you have no secular authority. There's no reason for him to be king other than his kingness. We're back in the Lacanian universe where Lacan says that the ultimate fool is the king who really believes himself to be king. And that if you took that idea and you made a movie about it, it would be Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which is that he really believes himself to be king, which is fine if you're in your castle, because there's this holy, I don't know, monarch who is like the representative of God on earth, and then all the power of the institution trickles down from there. But then he goes out into the world and he realizes that no one really cares. No one cares about why he is the most beneficial ruler. It's just that he's king. And so he comes across these two peasants, spoilers for Monty Python and the Holy Grail. He comes across these two peasants, and the peasants are like, oh, there's some beautiful dirt over here, blah, blah. They're just like milling through dirt.
As a gardener, I feel like I say that all the time. I get really excited about finding a nice patch of dirt. Like, it's really nice.
And then so he goes over to these peasants to like ask them for directions or something. And then one of them like turns out to be like very literate, like Republican Enlightenment figure. Who talks about like the power being corruption, etc., and like gives him a whole rant, and the king doesn't know what to do with this. Like he finds it annoying, if anything. And so that's the Monty Python and the Holy Grail. He's constantly being confronted with the fact that like his power is absolute. The funny thing is, the comedy wouldn't be the king goes out and finds out that he has no power. That wouldn't be very funny. What's funny is that he goes out and finds that his power is actually absolute, i.e. it makes no sense to anybody else. It has no bearing on the actual world. This is the impotence of God. Yes. This is also the divine comedy of God failing through Christ, in a sense. And in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, there's literally a scene where a God appears. They pray to God to make God appear, and God, he's like, stop your groveling, like this. Anyway, it's a great movie. Monty Python and the Holy Grail is very funny.
Yeah.
But your original question was, there was something I feel like I got off track.
No, I don't think so. Well, I was also thinking about Boris Godunov, which is another great opera about the tension between divine and secular power and authority, and the figure of the king as being this sort of untouchable but haunted by his own violence and action.
It's hot. Boris Godunov. Yeah, we should do Boris Godunov, but let's do it next week.
Yeah,
is that okay? Because it would be really nice to do a longer Mussorgsky piece on Boris Godunov. I'd really love to do that, but I think we should give it its due time. We should give it its own time. Because it's actually my favorite opera. Boris Godunov was quite interesting. Although you always, the thing is, it's a very unfortunate title, because when you watch Boris Godunov, you immediately think that instead of it being like a serious Russian Mussorgsky opera, you think to yourself that you're back in the realm of the comedic operas, the Pirates of Penzance, because imagine a king and his name is Good Enough, right? That's the whole, because it's for me it's a joke, because the whole idea is that he comes to the throne by illicit means. The mistake that the mistake that Boris Godunov makes, the mistake that the character makes, is that he believes that anybody comes into power through licit means, through legal means. Yes. This is again Brecht's, I keep quoting this, but Brecht who says, what is, every great fortune contains a great crime. And the problem is that Boris Godunov is a true believer. He believes that there is a genuine legitimacy to the state, and that because he is ascended to power by means of regicide, that he has somehow corrupted the very thing that he wanted to be. What he doesn't realize is that no one assumes divine power through licit means. That the whole realm of legality of law stems as the trickle down of the divine institution of the monarchy. And so he's a totally doomed figure, and a tragicomic figure in many ways here, even though it's not a tragicomic opera, because he again is the Lacanian fool, the king who believes he's really king. Yes. He believes so much in the institution that he believes that because he became king through regicide, he can't be the actual king. Right. And of course, that is the exact point of breakdown. The only thing worse than not believing is really believing. You're back at the young pope here, right? He says to believe in God is to believe in nothing else. Yeah. The absolute belief in God means that you don't believe in the legitimacy of the institution. Yeah. The problem is a king who genuinely believes in the institution, a president who genuinely believes in his power, will completely fail. The only person who doesn't get to believe is the person who is in charge. That is, and so that's also, again, the Monty Python.
Well, I'm thinking about that in terms of the tension between the individual and the institution, between the law and the schism in the law, and how the exception creates its own rule.
There's a really good example of this where this is years ago, there was an interview with Obama, and Obama asked what part of the job he enjoyed most and of being president, and what part of the job he enjoyed least. And he said the part of the job that he enjoyed least was actually what he found to be the most important one, which is a huge part of being president is ceremonial. We don't have a monarch in the United States, and so the president has to do what a monarch does, which is a ton of their time, I mean, apart from fundraising. Imagine the Queen fundraising, by the way, right? This is one of the beauties of
But she does fundraise.
No, but her people do it for her.
Yeah, but I mean, she still gets wheeled out anyway.
It's property.
Yes.
No.
Yeah.
Having a monarch is extremely lucrative, but she doesn't have to do it. It's much more efficient. It's much more efficient to fundraise if you have the idea of the monarch. And one of the problems of being a secular president, like, I don't know, Macron or Obama, is they have to do a lot of fundraising themselves, which is not very efficient. So Obama said that the part of the job that he enjoyed the least, but he realized was very important, was all the ceremonial functions. Because the president has to be there for a bunch of stuff. He doesn't have to do anything, he just has to be there and be semi-articulate. And in a sense, the funny thing is, if we had a monarch in the United States, it would be much more efficient in that sense, because like we could just have somebody stand there, and then the president could go and do the work.
Well, and I think historically that was also the role of the vice president, was to do a lot of that symbolic ceremonial stuff. But how is that dealt with in countries like Germany?
It's so I was just going to say, it's beautiful that you mentioned the vice president, because what's happening right now with like Kamala Harris, for example, is that it exposes the symbolicness that the new form of ritual is to participate in the things that are important to the left. Voter suppression reform and immigration reform, right?
Yeah.
What are you doing?
I'm going to try and close these blinds a little bit because I can tell the sun is...
Oh, we're almost done. Don't worry about it. We'll stick it out. Yeah, it'll be just fine.
That's reason. Sorry.
It's going to get very hot today. And, I mean, you don't have to be here. I'm not forcing you to be here.
I want to be here because I like your...
I always worry that on camera it looks like I'm just, like, gaslighting you in this situation.
No.
Of course, that's what you would say. In Germany, they've solved this thing quite delicately, which is that the president has no power. The president is a ceremonial figure, and it's the, I guess you could say, the chancellor, who has all the political power.
But the thing is, for the right politician, the ceremonial position could be extremely powerful.
Yeah, that's true. But see, the funny thing about Trump, Trump again is that Donald Trump, when he was president, was the Lacanian fool, the king who believes himself to be king. Because Trump really enjoyed the ceremonial stuff.
Yes.
It almost seems as if Trump actually had no interest in doing everything else.
No, that's what he wanted. He only wanted the ceremony.
But this is the thing: is in Trump we had our king. Like I almost wonder if we should have made Trump king, like president for life. Someone gives him a medal and it's like, you are president for life. And then the president gets, we elect another president. You know what I mean? And that's already happening because a lot of Republicans are now literally coming up with awards that don't exist to give to Donald Trump so that they can gain his favor. I'm not being cynical about this. I think that is also how power works very much. Like at the end of the day, all awards don't exist. This is, again, to believe in God means that you believe in nothing else. If you genuinely believe in the Holy Grace, power, all that stuff, if you genuinely believe in the importance of it, then everything else is an empty shell. Yeah. All awards are empty shells. It's only if you don't believe in God that you start putting importance into awards. I'm not saying God literally. I'm not saying Christian versus non-Christian. The idea of like an omnipotent...
A philosophical God.
Yeah, exactly. That everything else becomes meaningful. Like, the funny thing is, again, if God appeared all of a sudden, hello, I'm God, etc., awards would mean nothing anymore. Like, what is an award even compared to that? And so the funny thing is that, and again, faith also, one of the things that I keep saying is that Christianity is a doubt-centric religion. And this actually goes back to Paul and the idea of love. Because what we don't talk about is, what I haven't talked about yet, is when we have faith, grace, and hope, love is the most powerful of those. Like, Paul talks about love as being like a scorched earth tactic. It's like a very radical thing. And that's something that we're going to develop in the next lecture, but it's like, what is the role of love here specifically? But what's so important, I sort of got off track a little bit. I was like, here's what we're going to talk about. What's so important here is this idea is that, imagine for a moment that God suddenly appeared, and it was no longer a doubt-centric religion. In other words, if we had full certainty of a deity existing, not only would this be a shocking event, it would be also a loss. It would be a loss of the central principle of Christianity. There's this total pseudo psychology for a moment. The 5 stages of grief. The 5 stages of grief, which are not clinically borne out to mean anything. They're sort of fun. They exist in pop culture. You and I saw the Cruella movie yesterday.
Yes.
And she mentions the 5 stages of grief. And they're not like linear, first of all, but they're usually like considered a denial, right? You deny that something's happening to you. Then you have anger. You're angry that it's happening to you. Then you have bargaining. You try to bargain with it. Then you have depression, and then you have acceptance. And so a lot of people, like, if God suddenly appeared, it would be a loss of the loss of God. And so if God suddenly appeared, you would have the same stages. You would have, first of all, you would have denial. That's not God. It's not God. This can't be God. This is some fool, some pseudo-messiah. This is also like the Jewish stance towards Christ.
Well, it's also the question about, I was thinking about UFOs and aliens, and like to what extent is that, this is taking us too off topic, sorry.
But but this is like, I want to, like, this is the whole Paulinian stance towards like the New Testament as well, right? You have Christ who shows up, and this whole, not God, we don't care it's God. Then we have the idea that we're angry. Well, if this is God, what a shitty Christ is this? How, if Christ was going to come, we thought he was going to have like a pimp cane and like be like amazing and do all kinds of miracles. Instead we get this guy with the long hair and the beard and doesn't really do anything, and he, I don't know, eats fish with people. There's that anger moment, right? Then we have the, am I just, you're like, oh, I know where you're going here, yeah, sorry. Then we have the bargaining moment, right? The bargaining is like, oh, no, this is probably not really happening, etc. Like, we need to figure out a way to do this. This is also the doubt that is within the apostles, for example, who are bargaining with Christ. Don't go into the church. Don't you know this is going to be death if you go here, etc. And then we have the idea that we have depression, which is, what do we do now? Mourning Christ on the cross, etc. And then acceptance. And that's where the Christian community comes from. That's how you would do it in a pseudo-pop way. But more fun than that, much more fun than that, would be to say, well, how would those 5 stages apply if God actually appeared? The same thing would happen, because we now have a Christian faith that is precipitated on the idea of the Christian community stepping in to breach the gap. If God suddenly appeared, he's like, hey, everybody, I'm God. First of all, we would say denial, not God. Then we would say basically we have anger, which is, well, screw you, God. Why are you showing up now? Like, this is also like I mean, it's already happened. Like, this whole thing has happened. Then we have bargaining, which is, God, can you please go away? God, could you just please go back to heaven? Just go back to heaven. We don't need God here. Then we would have depression, which is, oh shit, God is here.
This is the God we're stuck with.
God is here. Like, imagine someone should do like a comic book or an anime where God appears, and it's like we go through that whole cycle, and it's like you're everywhere, and it's like, God, just like it's so disappointing. It's so anticlimactic in a sense. So you go through that stage of depression, and then finally acceptance. Okay, God is just another form of power, and that's of course exactly what Christ and God is not within the Pauline universe. Is that he's not here. He doesn't care. He's not omnipotent. He is not guaranteeing you anything. He's not even giving you a set of rules to follow. It's all up to you. And if you have faith that it is up to you, then maybe, just maybe, it will turn out to have been worth it. That's not very fun. And so it's really funny to me that then, in a sense, it's much more today, like, I think that dimension of Christianity, that split within the logic of the universal and the particular, that split where human subjectivity has to step in, and how radical that is a dimension that I think is lost in contemporary approaches towards spirituality, where it's just, because one of the lessons of, let's say it like, of philosophy, is that there is no immanent truth to you. There's no truth in here, and if you dig deep enough, you're going to find that truth. And there's no truth up there. That's idealism. That's what we want to reject. There's no immanent truth up there, and if only you can get there. No. The truth is always in the barrier itself. The truth is in the thing that seems to keep you from the truth. The truth is a process, as you said, like
it's the mediation.
Exactly, yeah. And so I understand that it's comforting to say, oh, just go in yourself. There's not much there at the end of the day. Like, this thing that I always love is when people get really into meditation and then they have like a psychological breakdown. It's like, it's good to think about nothing, but eventually you realize there is nothing. You're not that special. There's not that much there. The struggle is what's special. The incapability of being you is what's special. The believing in something despite having no evidence for it being there is special. I mean, special is kind of a derivative word here. And so the truth process isn't just about obtaining the empirical evidence of something. The truth process is actually the pursuit of truth itself. This is where Nietzsche is more loyal to the Christian. This is again where I said that, like, to be a real atheist, you have to go through Christianity. Same is true for Nietzsche. The will to knowledge, and Kierkegaard, there's like the idea of suffering and anxiety, the disjointedness of being alive in general. There's more truth in that than there is in the idea of a whole complete universe and a whole complete self. And that's something that the Paulinian doctrine, if you want to call it that, starts setting up. And that we're constantly rediscovering, whether it's called, like Karl Barth. When Karl Barth reads the Epistles of the Romans, he's like, a light bulb goes off in his head, and it's like, oh, there's something here that I didn't see. And so that's like, if you really want to be an atheist today, spend a lot of time with Christianity. There's an atheist kernel to the truth process in Christianity itself. And there's a dimension in Christianity that is so integral to the development of Western philosophy that I think that if you're not interested in, you're missing out a little bit. And so when a lot of people ask me, how do you believe, or are you a theist, etc., to me it's a dumb question. I mean, I always say there are no dumb questions. There are dumb questions. I understand that people ask that because they want a yes or no answer from you. And it's like, my version of belief is specifically related to not believing. And it's not just an evasive rhetorical question. It's that not believing is the condition of belief within Christianity. Not believing is the condition for faith. You go back to Marcuse. Freedom is the condition for liberation. That is what the event of the cross is. It is freedom from the law of the Judeo society, of the Galician society, and it is an empty freedom unless you fill it in with liberation. And so you are given the opportunity, and you don't have to be a Christian to see this. I mean, whatever, you don't have to be a Christian to do anything. If you are given freedom, you have to decide what you do with that freedom. And that is the condition for your liberation. It's very, very easy to be unfree. Hegel understood this when he said that the slave is happier than the master. To be a genuine master is to understand what you do with your freedom. And I think that is ultimately the idea of emancipation. So, Paul is really important. And once we go from Paul, we're going to be able to start understanding Augustine, who's reacting to Paul, Aquinas, who's reacting to Paul, etc. So thank you guys for being here today. I appreciate you for your time.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us in our hotel room. It is a heat wave outside. In fact, we're going to crank up the AC in just a moment.
Yes.
Because it's getting really hot in here. And we're going to go on to Discord for another hour where we're going to answer your questions and talk further. And yeah, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Jeneline, for being part of this. We are going to be in Seattle until tonight, and we're gonna travel during the night. We're gonna sneak out at night when it's relatively cool, when it's only 9
when
degrees.
it's only in the 90s, yes.
And we shall all see you next Friday. All right, guys, thank you very much. Appreciate you all, and we shall see you next week.
Yeah.
All
Take
right.
care, everyone.
Thank you. Let's close this.